The moment Edna Graves stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she looked at the cracked, sun-bleached Main Street, put her hands on her hips, and said loudly enough for the entire gathering crowd to hear, "Well, I have seen prettier sights on a Tuesday morning in a Chicago alley, but I suppose this will have to do." The crowd gathered outside the Dusty Creek General Store went utterly silent. Three men in leather vests stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A woman in a bonnet clutched her market basket to her chest. A stray dog lifted its head, then lowered it again, apparently deciding the newcomer was not worth the trouble. Clarence Ramsey stood at the back of that small gathering, his hat pushed back on his head, a letter folded in the breast pocket of his good Sunday shirt, which he had pressed that very morning with considerable effort, and a cast iron he had borrowed from his neighbor Mrs. Hawthorne. He stared at the woman who had just descended from the stage with a large trunk, a carpet bag, a hat box, and an opinion, and he felt something loosen inside his chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. He was 31 years old. He had tried this once before, 2 years ago, with a woman named Clara who had taken one look at the ranch outside of town and wept for 3 days before boarding the next coach back to Missouri. He had written to the Matrimonial Gazette in Denver after that, taking considerably longer to compose his second letter, and he had been very specific this time. He did not want a woman who wanted to be coddled. He did not want a woman who would silently resent the dust and the heat and the honest work of keeping a cattle ranch alive. He had written, with some embarrassment but ultimately with full sincerity, that he wanted a woman who would tell him the truth, whatever the truth happened to be, because he had spent enough of his life surrounded by men who told him what he wanted to hear, and a ranch that kept secrets from him, until those secrets became expensive problems. What he had received in return, after 3 months of letters and one formal agreement, was Edna Graves of Chicago, Illinois, aged 26, formerly employed as a seamstress and a bookkeeper for a textile firm on the north side of the city, who had written back to him in her very first letter with words that had made him read the page 3 times just to be certain he had understood correctly. She had written, "Mr. Ramsey, I will be honest with you from the start, as I expect you to be honest with me. I do not romanticize the West. I have read enough penny novels to know they are largely fiction. I am not coming to you because I dream of sunsets and wide-open spaces, though I imagine both exist in abundance. I am coming because I am 26 years old. I am practical by nature and circumstance. I have no family left to speak of, and I believe a life built on mutual honesty and shared labor is a good life worth building. If that is also what you are looking for, then I think we should continue this correspondence. If you are hoping for someone who will gasp with wonder at every cactus, I suggest you seek elsewhere." Clarence had laughed out loud when he read that, alone at his kitchen table, and the laugh had surprised him so much that he had covered his mouth with his hand as though someone might hear him in the empty house. He had written back immediately. And now here she was, standing in the dust of Dusty Creek with her carpet bag in one hand, and an expression on her face that suggested she was already cataloging everything that needed improvement, and Clarence Ramsey stepped forward through the crowd and removed his hat and said, "Miss Graves." She turned and looked at him. She was not what he had pictured, though he was not entirely sure what he had pictured. She was medium height, with dark brown hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had seen better days, and dark eyes that moved over him with an assessment so frank it almost made him step back. She wore a practical gray dress with no unnecessary ornamentation, and her face was not what anyone would call conventionally beautiful, but it was the kind of face that looked like it meant every single thing it did, which Clarence found immediately more interesting than beautiful. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and she extended her hand. Not to be helped down because she was already down, just to shake. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "You're taller than I imagined," she said. "You're earlier than I expected," he replied. "The stage runs late as a rule. I persuaded the driver to make up time at the last junction, she said. He was stopping for entirely too long at every water barrel. Clarence looked at the stagecoach driver, a man named Pete Colby whom he had known for 6 years, and Pete Colby was standing beside his horses with the expression of a man who had survived something and was still processing the fact. Clarence looked back at Edna. "Did you talk to him the whole way from San Antonio?" Clarence asked. "I talked to him when talking was necessary," Edna said. "I also pointed out twice that his left rear wheel had a loosened iron tire, which he denied until the iron tire came half off outside of Redrock, and we had to stop for 40 minutes to fix it. I did not say I told you so, but I thought it quite loudly." Clarence Ramsey put his hat back on his head and smiled, and it was not the polite smile he had been practicing in his shaving mirror for the past 2 days. It was a real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. "Miss Graves," he said, "I have been waiting for exactly this." She raised one eyebrow at him. "For a woman to point out a bad tire. For a woman who notices things and says them out loud," he said. She studied him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, the way a door shifts when it is not quite latched and a breeze finds the gap. "Well," she said, "then perhaps we are already off to a reasonable start." He took her trunk himself, carrying it toward the wagon he had hitched outside the general store, and she walked beside him carrying her carpet bag with no apparent expectation of help with it, which he noted and appreciated. The small crowd dispersed, though not without a great deal of murmuring. Dusty Creek was a town of approximately 400 souls, and news traveled through it the way fire traveled through dry grass. Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been watching from the porch of the general store with the careful attention of a woman who considered herself the town's chief historian, leaned toward her friend Mrs. Prout and said, "She is not what I expected." Mrs. Prout, who had a kinder nature, said, "She seems very capable." "She seems like she will run that poor man ragged," Mrs. Hawthorne said, but there was something almost admiring in her tone that she had not intended to be there. Clarence loaded the trunk into the wagon bed, and Edna climbed up onto the bench seat before he could offer his hand, and then she looked down at him waiting and said, "Are you planning to stand there, or are we going to drive?" He climbed up and took the reins, and they drove out of Dusty Creek toward the Ramsey Ranch, which lay 4 miles south of town, along a dirt road that wound through low scrub and red rock. The afternoon sun was already beginning to lower itself toward the horizon, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with orange and rose and deep purple at the edges, the kind of sky that appeared regularly over West Texas and never quite lost its power to stop a person mid-thought. Edna was quiet for the first mile, looking at the landscape with an expression that was impossible to read. Then she said, "Tell me the truth about the ranch." "What do you mean?" Clarence asked. "Tell me what is actually wrong with it," she said. "Every place has something wrong with it. I would rather know now than discover it in pieces." He was quiet for a moment, deciding whether to give her the rehearsed answer or the honest one. He gave her the honest one. "The east fence needs replacing, and I have not had the money for it this past winter because we had a bad cattle season. I lost 11 head to a fever that went through the herd in October. The ranch house is clean, but it needs a new roof on the kitchen addition, which leaks when the rain comes in from the north. The well is solid. The horses are healthy. I have 3 hands working for me, all of them reliable, and about 240 head of cattle right now, which is less than I want but enough to work with. The land itself is good land. I believe in it, but it is not a finished thing. It is a thing in progress." Edna was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "That is a more honest answer than I anticipated." "I told you in my letters I would be honest," he said. "People say that in letters," she said. "Then they are not." "I meant it," he said. She looked at him sideways, and then she looked back at the road, and she said, "The east fence. What gauge wire are you using?" He blinked. "Barbed wire, the standard gauge." "The heavier gauge holds better in this kind of soil," she said. "My father had a farm in Ohio before we moved to Chicago. I know about fences." Clarence turned to look at her fully, and she was still looking at the road, her profile steady and composed in the low golden light. He had not known about her father's farm. He had known about Chicago and the textile firm and the bookkeeping. He had not known about Ohio and fences. "You are full of surprises, Miss Graves," he said. "I am full of practical information," she corrected. "I find people often mistake one for the other." The ranch appeared as they crested a long, low rise, and it was exactly as Clarence had described it. A main house built of stone and timber, solid and unpretentious, with a covered porch running along the front, a barn that had recently been painted a deep red, two smaller structures for the ranch hands, a working windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze, and the flat land running out in every direction under the enormous sky. It was not pretty in the way that parlor paintings were pretty. It was pretty in the way that honest things are pretty, with all their utility showing. Edna looked at it as they pulled into the yard. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She looked at it the way she had looked at Clarence himself, with clear eyes and full attention. "The roof on the kitchen addition will need to be done before the summer rains," she said, "and you will want to plant something near the south side of the house to cut the afternoon heat. Shade matters more than people acknowledge." "I have been meaning to plant trees there for 2 years," Clarence said. "Then we had better get started," she said, and climbed down from the wagon. His 3 ranch hands were in the yard waiting, hat in hand, because Dusty Creek's unofficial news service had already reached the ranch by way of one of the hands who had been in town that morning and ridden back ahead of the wagon. They were Tom Briggs, a stocky, sunburned man of about 35 who had worked for Clarence since the beginning, Dutch Vander, a quiet man of German extraction who rarely spoke but worked without ceasing, and young Bobby Ames, who was 19 years old and had a face like a retriever puppy, eager and good-natured and perpetually surprised by the world. Edna shook each of their hands in turn, looking each man directly in the eye, which Clarence noticed made Bobby Ames go pink to the ears. "Miss Graves," Tom Briggs said carefully, with the tone of a man who had heard the stagecoach story and was recalibrating his expectations. "Mr. Briggs," Edna said, "Mr. Ramsey tells me you are reliable. I am glad to hear it. A ranch runs on reliable people." Tom Briggs glanced at Clarence with an expression that said this was not what he had expected, and Clarence gave him the smallest possible nod, a nod that said, "She is exactly what I told you she was," which was true because Clarence had read them several of her letters over the past months, and they had all of them grown quietly curious. Clarence showed Edna the house. It was clean, as he had promised, because he had spent the better part of the previous 2 days cleaning it with a thoroughness that had amused Tom Briggs considerably. The main room served as a sitting room and dining room both, with a good stone fireplace. The kitchen was workable, with a cast-iron stove that was one of the better things on the property. There were 2 bedrooms, and Clarence had prepared the second one for her, understanding entirely that propriety and their arrangement required that they sleep separately until they were married, which they were not yet. Edna moved through the house with her eyes open and her mouth closed, which was a reversal of the pattern she had established in the past hour, and he watched her noticing everything with a feeling he could not quite name, somewhere between anxiety and something warmer. In the kitchen, she opened every cabinet. She looked at the stove. She checked the firebox. She examined the state of the coffee grinder. Then she turned to him and said, "Who has been cooking?" "Tom, mostly," Clarence said. "He is adequate." "I will take over the kitchen," she said. "Not because I think it is a woman's only domain, but because I am a good cook and I can see that the 3 of you have been eating badly for some time based on the state of these provisions. There is no variety and too much salt pork." "That is entirely accurate," Clarence said. "We should go to town tomorrow and resupply," she said, "and I want to look at your account books." He had not expected that. "The account books? You said you had a bad cattle season and money was tight," she said. "I am a bookkeeper. I was a bookkeeper for 4 years. I would like to understand the financial state of the ranch so I know what we are working with. I am not going to pretend I have married into a comfortable situation if the situation requires work. I would rather know the numbers." Clarence looked at her for a long moment, standing in his kitchen in the fading light of a West Texas evening, and he thought about Clara who had wept for 3 days, and he thought about the 2 years of loneliness that had followed, and he thought about the night he had written to the Matrimonial Gazette, and felt vaguely ridiculous and desperate and quietly desperate in the way that a man living alone learns to be. And he thought about the letter he had received 3 months later with those first frank, startling, honest sentences. "The account books are in the desk in the sitting room," he said. "I will get them for you after supper." She nodded, as though this were perfectly ordinary because to her it apparently was. "Good," she said. "Now, do you have eggs?" They were married 4 days later at the small Presbyterian church on the edge of Dusty Creek, performed by the Reverend Elias Fowler, who was a thin, serious man with large spectacles and a genuine devotion to his work. The ceremony was attended by Tom Briggs and Dutch Vander and Bobby Ames, by Mrs. Hawthorne and Mrs. Prout, and about a dozen others from town who came partly out of goodwill and partly out of the same curiosity that had been circulating since the stagecoach incident. Edna wore a dress she had sewn herself, a deep blue that was the best color she owned, and she had pinned her hair up with more care than usual and looked, in Clarence's considered opinion, entirely lovely, though he had not yet told her so because he was still navigating the terrain of how to speak to this woman without sounding either foolish or false. When Reverend Fowler asked if Edna Graves took Clarence Ramsey to be her lawfully wedded husband, she said, "I do," with the same direct tone she used for everything, clear and unhesitating. And when the Reverend asked Clarence the same, Clarence looked at her and said his "I do" and meant it with a depth that surprised even him. Afterward, at the small gathering at the ranch that Tom Briggs had organized with quiet good nature, with a table set outside in the cool evening air, and a pie that Bobby Ames had purchased from the bakery in town and carried out wrapped in cloth, Edna sat beside Clarence and looked at the darkening sky and said, "You realize we do not know each other very well." "I realize that," he said. "Most people in our situation pretend that letters are the same as knowing someone," she said. "I never pretended that," he said. She turned and looked at him, and in the low lantern light her dark eyes were warm in a way that her voice did not quite express yet. "No," she said, "you did not. That is one of the things I noticed about your letters. You did not pretend. I have found pretending mostly wastes time," he said. A small silence opened between them, comfortable in a way that surprised them both, and from across the table Bobby Ames was telling Dutch Vander some long story about a horse and a fence post, and Tom Briggs was refilling cups from a jug of cider, and the Texas night was enormous and full of stars, and Edna Graves, who was now Edna Ramsey, looked at it all and then back at her husband and said very quietly, "I think I am going to be glad I came." Clarence looked at her and said, equally quietly, "I think I already am." The weeks that followed were, in Clarence's experience, unlike anything he had previously known. Marriage in theory was a thing he had thought about in abstract terms, comfort and partnership, and the end of eating alone. Marriage in practice, to Edna Graves Ramsey, was something significantly more specific and considerably more alive. She was in the account books within 2 days, and by the end of the first week, she had organized them into a state of clarity that made Clarence somewhat embarrassed about the chaos she had found them in. She spread the ledgers across the kitchen table on a Saturday morning and walked him through what she had found with the same tone she used for everything, matter of fact and without judgment, but not withholding the truth either. "You are carrying debt on the east fence materials that you ordered in the fall and have not yet had the money to buy," she said. "And you are paying a premium on your feed because you are buying small quantities from Harlan's store in town, rather than negotiating a bulk rate with the supplier in San Antonio. The difference over a year is significant." Clarence leaned over the table and looked at the numbers she had written in her neat, careful hand. "I did not know there was a bulk rate to negotiate," he said. "There is always a bulk rate to negotiate if you write the right letter," she said. "I will write it. I know how to write to suppliers. I did it for 4 years." He looked at her. She was wearing a work dress with her sleeves pushed up, and she had a pencil behind her ear, and she was looking at the ledgers with the concentrated attention of someone who found numbers genuinely interesting rather than merely tolerable. And Clarence felt something he had not expected to feel this early, which was admiration. Deep, honest admiration. "You are very good at this," he said. She looked up as though she had not anticipated the comment. "I know," she said, which was not arrogance. It was simply the truth stated plainly, and then more quietly, not many people said so. "At the textile firm?" he asked. "At the textile firm and everywhere before it," she said. "Women are not generally encouraged to be good at numbers. They are encouraged to pretend they are not." "That seems like a waste," Clarence said. Edna looked at him for a long moment. With that expression he was learning to read, the one where something moved behind her eyes before her face decided what to do with it. Then she said, "Yes, it is exactly a waste." She wrote the letter to the supplier in San Antonio that same afternoon, and the response came back within 2 weeks with a rate that, when applied to their annual feed costs, saved them enough money over the course of a year to begin addressing the east fence. Clarence read the response letter twice, standing by the mailbox on the road, and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and walked back to the house where Edna was on the porch with her mending, and he said, "The San Antonio supplier agreed." She looked up. "I expected they would," she said. "You should be proud of yourself," he said. "I should be useful," she said. "Proud can come later." But she was smiling when she said it, just slightly, and he was learning that her smiles were rare enough to be worth something, the way water is worth more in the desert than anywhere else. The town of Dusty Creek had its own process of adjustment to Edna Ramsey, which was not entirely smooth. She went to town with Clarence twice in the first month, and both times she said things at the general store that the town filed away under the category of notable events. The first time, she told Silas Harlan, the store's proprietor, that he was charging a 16% markup on beeswax candles above the catalog price, which she knew because she had looked up the catalog price before coming to town, and that she would appreciate it if he applied the same pricing to her purchases as to everyone else's. Silas Harlan, a round man of 50 with a mustache that was his chief vanity, turned an interesting color. Around him, 3 other women who had been shopping turned away to hide their expressions, 2 of them hiding smiles and 1 hiding something more complicated. Silas said, after a moment, that there were overhead costs to running a store, and Edna said that she understood overhead costs very well, having managed accounts for a business considerably larger than a general store, and that she was not suggesting he take no profit, only that his profit be consistent. Silas applied the catalog pricing to her candles. The second time, she told the town's sole doctor, a Dr. Clement Horace who maintained a small office above the land office on the main street, that his advice to Mrs. Pruitt regarding her persistent cough was insufficient, and she ought to be looked at more carefully, because a cough that had persisted for 6 weeks in a woman of 60 was not simply dust in the lungs, and deserved better investigation. Dr. Horace, who had trained in St. Louis in the 1850s and was not accustomed to being redirected, said stiffly that he had examined Mrs. Pruitt and given his professional opinion. Edna said that was fine, and that she had sent away for a medical reference book from the catalog, and would share it with him when it arrived in case it was useful. He looked like he had swallowed something disagreeable. Mrs. Pruitt herself, when Edna came to visit her that same afternoon, took Edna's hand with genuine gratitude and said, "No one has ever spoken up for me quite like that before." "You should not have needed me to," Edna said, "but I am glad it was useful." The reference book arrived 3 weeks later, and Edna left it with Dr. Horace with a note that was polite, and without any trace of the "I told you so" she had restrained herself from expressing at Sela's Harlan store. Dr. Horace, who was in fact a decent man beneath his stiffness, read it and subsequently treated Mrs. Prout for a chronic condition that responded well to rest and an adjustment of her diet. He did not thank Edna directly, but he began nodding to her on the street with rather more respect than before, which Edna considered equivalent. Dusty Creek was not exclusively charmed by Edna Ramsey. There was a faction, led loosely by Mrs. Hawthorne, that found her directness inappropriate for a woman, and especially inappropriate for a woman who had arrived as a mail-order bride and ought, in Mrs. Hawthorne's view, to be conducting herself with more deference and less certainty. This view was expressed in various parlors around town in language that Edna was aware of, because in a town of 400 people nothing remains private for long, and Edna had good instincts about social currents. She brought it up to Clarence one evening in late May, when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last of the light drain from the western sky. The early summer heat was beginning to settle in, but the evening still had that particular West Texas sweetness, warm but not oppressive, with a breeze that came down from the north and made the windmill spin in long, slow rotations. "Mrs. Hawthorne does not like me," Edna said, not in a distressed way. Just stating the fact, Clarence considered the statement. "She does not like anything that surprises her," he said. "You surprise her." "She thinks I am too forthright for a woman of my circumstances," Edna said. "She thinks I should be quieter and more grateful." "What do you think?" Clarence asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I think that if I had spent the past 26 years being quieter and more grateful, I would have ended up exactly where I did end up, which was alone in Chicago with no family and no prospects, except that I would also not have been myself." She paused. "So I do not think the quiet and grateful approach was particularly effective." Clarence looked at her profile in the fading light. He had been looking at her profile a great deal lately, he realized. He had been looking at her face more generally, studying it the way you study a landscape you want to know well, finding the details that distinguish it from all other landscapes. The small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. The way her jaw set when she was thinking hard. The way her eyes changed in the evenings, darker and somehow more open than they were in the bright working daylight. "I do not want you to be quiet," he said. "I want you to be exactly as you are." She turned and looked at him, and whatever she had expected him to say, that was apparently not it. "Clarence," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name without the form of address in front of it, without the Mr., without the careful social distance that their first weeks together had maintained. Just his name in her voice, quiet and direct. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked back at the sky, and something had changed in the air between them. Not dramatically, the way the temperature changes at dusk, gradually and entirely. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right. I came here because I was practical," she said. "And because I was honest with myself about my situation. But I want you to know that I was also, in a small way, hopeful, not about the ranch or the West specifically, about the possibility of a person who actually meant what they said. I had not encountered many of those." "I meant what I said," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been watching for it, and I have not caught you in a single dishonesty. That is more than I expected." "I have been watching you too," he said. "And?" she asked, with a careful tone that was as close to vulnerability as he had yet heard from her. "And I think you are the most interesting person I have ever met," he said. "And I think I am extremely glad the Matrimonial Gazette printed my letter," she laughed. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her, not the small controlled sounds of amusement she made at Bobby Ames's stories, but an actual laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her whole face. He felt it hit him somewhere in the center of his chest like a perfectly thrown stone hitting water. They sat on the porch long after full dark, and for the first time they talked not about the ranch or the finances or the town or practical matters, but about everything else. about Ohio and Chicago and her parents, both dead now. Her father from a heart ailment when she was 18 and her mother from influenza 2 years later. About the textile firm and the 4 years of careful, accurate bookkeeping for a man who had paid her 2/3 what he paid the male clerk in the same position, and justified it with the logic that she did not have a family to support, as though her own life were not a family worth supporting. About what she had wanted, quietly and privately, underneath the practical surface of her practical life. Clarence told her about the ranch, about how he had come to Texas from Virginia at the age of 22 with his older brother James, who had died of a snakebite in the 4th summer, before the ranch had become properly established, and how he had continued alone because stopping had not felt like an option, and the land had already begun to matter to him the way few things had in his life. He told her about Clara without embarrassment, just the facts of it, and she listened without judgment. "Were you heartbroken?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I was disappointed, and I was lonely afterward, but I do not think Clara and I were ever truly right for each other. We wanted different things, and she had every right to want what she wanted. I just needed to find someone who wanted what I wanted. Which is this," he said, and he gestured at the dark ranch, the windmill, the vast sky. "This life, built honestly, worked at, genuinely real." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I want that too." "I think you already know that," he said. She smiled in the dark, and he could just see it, the outline of it. And he thought that he was a man who had spent 2 years learning to be content with his own company, and had perhaps forgotten what it felt like to look forward to coming home to someone. And now that he was remembering, it was a feeling of remarkable warmth and considerable power. June arrived in a blaze of heat, and the ranch settled into its summer rhythms. Edna had reorganized the kitchen entirely within the first month. Not dramatically, but precisely. Everything in a logical place that made cooking efficient. And the meals that came from that kitchen were so significantly better than what Tom Briggs had been producing that all 3 hands were quietly devoted to her within a fortnight. Bobby Ames, in particular, had taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway at random intervals on the pretext of asking questions about ranch business, which always turned out to be about food. "You keep coming to the kitchen, Bobby," Edna said one morning without looking up from the bread she was making. "I had a question," Bobby said. "Ask it." "It can wait," he said, and backed out. She looked at Clarence, who was sitting at the table with his coffee. He was doing his level best not to smile. She pointed the bread spoon at him. "Do not encourage him," she said. "I am not doing anything," he said. "You are smiling," she said. "I am allowed to smile," he said. "You are very entertaining." She put the bread spoon down and looked at him, and then she walked over to the table and stood beside him, and he tilted his head back to look up at her, and she looked down at him. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm and full of the smell of bread and coffee, and outside the windmill was spinning in the early morning breeze, and everything was very ordinary, and also, somehow, extraordinary. She leaned down and kissed him quickly on the top of his head, which was a gesture so unexpected from a woman of her composure that he sat absolutely still for a full 3 seconds after she did it. "For not smiling when I specifically asked you not to," she said, and went back to her bread. He touched the top of his head and then put his hand down and drank his coffee with the expression of a man who has just experienced something very good and is determined not to make too large a thing of it in case it disappears. The east fence became the project of July. Clarence had ordered the heavier gauge wire that Edna had recommended, and the savings from the San Antonio feed supplier had made it possible. And on the first Monday of July, all 4 of them went out to the east pasture in the early morning before the heat became intolerable and began the work. Edna came with them, which Tom Briggs had not expected, and she worked alongside them without complaint, holding wire and driving stakes with a practiced efficiency that Tom Briggs, after watching her for 20 minutes, acknowledged with a nod that in Tom Briggs's vocabulary was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. "You've done this before," he said. "Ohio," she said. "Right," he said. Dutch Vander, who had spoken to Edna perhaps 12 words in the 2 months she had been at the ranch, looked at her working and then said, without preamble, "Good fence." This was the most he had said to anyone all week. Edna looked at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Vander." And Dutch Vander nodded and went back to his work. Bobby Ames, working down the line from Clarence, said to him in a low voice, "She is something else, your wife." Clarence looked down the fence line at Edna, who was crouching to check the depth of a post hole with the focused attention she brought to everything, her hat pushed back on her head and her face pink from the sun, and he said, "Yes, she is." "You are the luckiest man in Dusty Creek," Bobby said. "I know it," Clarence said, and meant it completely. The trouble that arrived in August came from a man named Garrett Tilson, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew Garrett Tilson. He was a rancher of middling success whose property bordered the Ramsey land to the north, and he had a long-standing dispute with Clarence about a water access point on the creek that ran along the shared property boundary. It was the kind of dispute that existed across the West, wherever water was scarce and men were stubborn, and it had been in a state of unresolved tension since long before Edna arrived. What Garrett Tilson did in August was bring 3 of his men to the shared boundary fence on a Tuesday morning and begin moving the boundary markers, shifting them 8 feet south, which would give him access to an additional section of the creek bank and would technically constitute trespassing on Ramsey land. He did this on a Tuesday because he knew that Tuesdays, Clarence and his hands drove the herd to the south pasture for rotation and were not visible from the north property. What Garrett Tilson had not accounted for was Edna Ramsey, who was that Tuesday at the north edge of the property checking the new fence and carrying a rifle as a matter of routine because there had been coyote activity that week near the pasture. She saw what he was doing. She stood at a distance and watched for 5 minutes to be certain she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. Then she walked toward the men, and when she was within easy speaking distance she said, clearly and without particular emphasis, "Mr. Tilson, those markers belong where they were. I would appreciate you putting them back." Garrett Tilson was a large, weathered man of 45 with the confidence of someone who had rarely been told no by anyone he considered of lesser standing, which was most people. He turned and looked at Edna Ramsey with the rifle, and with the expression of someone who had expected to be alone and was recalibrating. "Mrs. Ramsey," he said, in a tone that placed her name very firmly inside quotation marks of condescension, "I don't think this is your business." "It is my husband's land, and therefore it is entirely my business," Edna said. "And I can see from here that you have moved 3 markers approximately 8 feet south of where the original survey placed them. I know where the original survey placed them because I have read the survey documents which are filed at the county seat in Laredo and which I requested a copy of 2 weeks ago when your man came through here last month and seemed overly interested in the boundary line." There was a silence. Garrett Tilson's 3 men looked at each other. "You sent for the survey documents," Garrett said slowly. "I did," Edna said, "along with the water rights filing, which I also have a copy of. Mr. Tilson, the creek access point has been registered to this property for 11 years. You have no claim to it. I am asking you, once and politely, to put those markers back where they belong. After that, I will ask your county sheriff to ask you, which will be less polite and will involve paperwork." Garrett Tilson stared at her. He was a man who had spent 20 years in West Texas managing people with pressure and bluster, and what he was looking at now was someone who had removed both of those tools from the conversation by simply having done her homework in advance. He was not accustomed to it. "Your husband know you ride around his property with legal documents and a rifle?" he asked. "My husband knows I am useful," she said. "Mr. Tilson, the markers." He put the markers back. He did not do it with good grace. He did it with the tight-jawed expression of a man who was furious and also entirely outmaneuvered, and then he and his 3 men rode away north without another word. Edna walked back to the house, cleaned the rifle, made lunch, and when Clarence came in from the south pasture at noon and sat down, she placed a bowl of stew in front of him and said, Garrett Tilson tried to move the north boundary markers this morning. I sent him away. But I think you should go to the county seat and register a formal record of the boundary line with a witness statement, so that if he tries again, there is an established legal position. Clarence stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He set it down. He looked at her. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him in the same even tone she told him everything, without drama, with all the relevant facts in order. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his stew. "You walked up to 3 of Tilson's men with a rifle," he said. "I had the rifle for the coyotes," she said. "I did not point it at anyone." "But you walked up to them alone," he said. "Someone needed to," she said. "They were there, I was there. It seemed logical." Clarence looked at her, and what he felt was a complicated mixture of things. There was relief that nothing had gone wrong. There was the beginning of anger at Tilson, which he would deal with separately. And there was something else, something that had been building for weeks and was becoming increasingly difficult to contain within the practical language he and Edna used with each other. This feeling that was significantly warmer and deeper and more insistent than admiration or appreciation or any of the useful, practical feelings he had started with. "Edna," he said. "I know," she said. "You are going to tell me to be more careful." "I was going to tell you that you are magnificent," he said. She stopped moving. She was standing at the stove, and she stopped and turned slowly and looked at him, and her expression did something complicated and then settled into something that was, unmistakably, moved. "Do not say that just because I dealt with Tilson," she said, but her voice was different. "I was going to say it before Tilson," he said. "Tilson just reminded me to say it today." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table and reached across and put her hand on his, and his hand turned immediately to hold hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the warm kitchen, and outside the windmill was spinning, and the cattle were grazing in the south pasture, and the sky was doing something wonderful with clouds and distant light. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may be becoming quite fond of you, Clarence Ramsey." "I am well past fond," he said. "I think I love you. I realize that may be inconveniently early to say." She looked at him, and her eyes were full of something large and careful. "It is not inconveniently early," she said. "It is exactly on time. I think I love you too. I have been trying to be practical about it, and it is not working very well." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, and she let him. And she was looking at him with that look that she rarely gave anyone, the entirely open one, with nothing held back. And Clarence Ramsey thought that the Matrimonial Gazette, for all its somewhat undignified nature, had managed to do something genuinely remarkable for him, and he would be grateful for it for the rest of his life. He went to the county seat in Laredo the following week, and filed the boundary documentation exactly as Edna had recommended. The clerk there was a methodical man named Mr. Alcott, who made Clarence a certified copy of the complete survey and water rights record with all the appropriate official notations, and Clarence brought it home and handed it to Edna, and she put it in the metal box under the desk where she kept the important documents, organized by date and category. With an index she had written herself on a small card glued to the inside of the box lid. He stood watching her file it and said, "You have an index." "Of course I have an index," she said. He shook his head slowly. "You are remarkable." She looked up and smiled at him, a full, proper smile, and he was no longer surprised by how it changed her whole face, because he had seen it enough times now to be watching for it, and he was always glad when it appeared. Garrett Tilson did not attempt the boundary markers again. September came, and with it the beginning of the fall cattle work, which was the most demanding period on any working ranch, and required all hands present and fully engaged, starting before first light and ending well after dark. Edna adjusted the household accordingly, moving meals earlier and later to accommodate the schedule, organizing the days with the same crisp efficiency she brought to everything. She also, without anyone particularly asking her to, began keeping a record of the herd's movements through the pasture rotations, tracking the health notations that Tom Briggs had previously maintained in a loose and inconsistent way, and producing a document at the end of September's first week that gave Clarence a clearer picture of the herd's condition than he had had all year. He looked at the document in the evening after supper with Edna sitting beside him at the table, and he went through it carefully, and then he looked at her and said, "You have been getting up at 4 in the morning to record the morning herd count." "Tom was doing it," she said, "but Tom writes in a way that requires translation. I started keeping a parallel record." "Edna, you do not have to do everything," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I want to. The ranch does better if the records are clear." He put the document down and looked at her. "When do you sleep?" he asked. She waved this away. "I sleep adequately. Edna, Clarence." They looked at each other in the lamplight, and then he said, "What do you need? Tell me something I can do for you that you have not already done for yourself." She considered this with genuine seriousness, as she considered everything. Then she said, "I should like to plant those trees on the south side of the house before the cold comes. If we plant them now, they will have the winter to establish, and they will give shade by next summer." "That is something you want for the house," he said. "What do you want for yourself?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The trees are for the house and for us equally. I do not separate those things." A pause. "I would like on Sunday to not work, to simply have one day where we do not work. I do not think I have had that since I arrived." "Then we will have it," he said immediately. "This Sunday, no work. Tom will say the cattle. Tom can manage the cattle for one day without me," Clarence said firmly. "This Sunday is for us." She looked at him with that open expression. "All right," she said. That Sunday they drove out in the wagon to a place Clarence knew. A long, flat shelf of red rock above the river bend south of the ranch, where the view stretched 40 miles in 3 directions, and the river ran clear over smooth stones below. And they sat in the shade of a cottonwood that had somehow found purchase in a crack of the rock shelf and grown tall and generous. And they ate the lunch Edna had packed and talked about nothing in particular and everything in general. And in the afternoon Clarence lay back on the rock with his hat over his face, and Edna sat beside him reading a book she had ordered from Chicago, and occasionally she read him a passage aloud, and he would comment from under his hat and she would respond, and they had, in this way, a long, relaxed, warm conversation about a book he had not read, which was among the most pleasant conversations he could remember having. On the drive home in the long gold light of late afternoon, she sat close beside him on the bench seat, and at some point her head found its way to his shoulder without either of them making a decision about it, and he shifted the reins to one hand and put his arm around her, and they drove home like that through the warm, golden September evening, with the horses knowing the way and the sky doing its nightly performance, and everything feeling settled and right, and full of the particular satisfaction of a life that has become genuinely good. He planted the trees on the south side of the house the following week. 6 young cottonwoods and 2 mesquite, placed with the precision that Edna had mapped out on paper with attention to the summer sun's angle and the prevailing wind. She was at his side for all of it, measuring the spacing, checking the depth of each hole, watering each tree and herself from the bucket she carried back and forth from the well. Bobby Ames helped and made admiring comments about the planting plan that were mostly directed at Edna, and Tom Briggs helped in silence with the digging, and Dutch Vander mixed the water and soil with a particular care that suggested he took the welfare of young trees personally. When the last tree was planted and watered and the tools were put away and the other men had gone to supper, Clarence and Edna stood and looked at the 8 small trees in a row along the south wall of the house, young and a little tentative-looking in the fading light, not yet the things they would become. "They will be beautiful in 5 years," Edna said. "In 10 years they will make the house almost cool in August," Clarence said. "We should plant more next spring," she said. "Along the east side as well." "We should," he agreed. They stood looking at the trees together, and then Edna turned to him and said, "Clarence." "Yes." "I want to tell you that I am happy," she said, as though this required the same careful precision as everything else she said. "I was not certain that I would be. I was hoping. But I am telling you now because I think you should know it, and because I do not believe in leaving important things unsaid." He turned to face her fully, and he took her face in his hands carefully, the way you hold something that matters, and he said, "So am I, Edna. So am I." And he kissed her properly for the first time. Not the quick kiss on the top of the head she had given him months ago, or the careful brushes of greeting that had developed between them in the weeks since, but a full and real kiss that had all the weight of everything they had been building toward behind it. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, completely and without reservation, and when they stepped back they looked at each other in the evening light, and she said, somewhat breathlessly, "Well, that was entirely worth the wait." He laughed, and she smiled, the full beautiful one that still caught him every time. The months that followed were the richest of Clarence Ramsey's adult life, and he was aware of this while they were happening, which he thought was perhaps unusual and certainly fortunate. He was aware of it in the mornings when he came into the kitchen and found Edna already there with the coffee made, and the morning light coming through the window and making everything gold, and she would hand him his cup and say something about the day that was either practical or sharp or occasionally both. And he would stand and drink his coffee and listen and feel the settled warmth of having someone genuinely present with him, not just in the house but fully, completely, attentively present. He was aware of it in the evenings when they sat on the porch and talked until the stars came out, covering every subject imaginable with the easy range of two people who find each other genuinely interesting and have a great deal to say. He was aware of it in the working days when she was at the desk with the account books, and he was in the yard, and he could hear her pencil moving through the open window, and the occasional sound of her voice when she called something to him. And the ordinariness of it was a kind of richness he had not expected. He was aware in October, when she came to find him in the east pasture on a Thursday afternoon and said, with the frank composure that characterized her approach to every piece of news, large or small, "I believe I am pregnant, Clarence. I'm not certain yet, but I believe so." He stood still in the sun-bright pasture with his fencing tool in his hand and looked at her, and what happened to his face was something he had no control over whatsoever. He was not a demonstrative man by habit. He had been raised in a Virginia household that valued composure and restraint, and 23 years of Texas ranching had not softened that, and he was, generally speaking, a man who kept his feelings at a controlled temperature. What happened to his face now was that every bit of that control became entirely irrelevant. He put down the fencing tool and crossed the space between them in 3 strides and put his arms around her, fully and completely, and she put her arms around him, and they stood in the east pasture in the October sun, and he held her, and she held him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. "Clarence," she finally said, her voice somewhat muffled by his shirt. "I know," he said. "You are holding me so tightly I cannot breathe particularly well." He loosened his arms. He kept them around her. "Is that better?" "Marginally," she said. She tipped her head back to look at him, and her eyes were bright, and there was something in her face that was entirely new, underneath all the usual composure, a kind of radiance that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with joy. "I want you to know that I am not alarmed," she said. "I am very happy." "So am I," he said. "Edna, so am I, doctor." Horace confirmed the pregnancy in the first week of November, with considerably more thoroughness than his usual practice, possibly because Edna asked him specific and detailed questions about the confirmation process, and he had learned from the reference book episode that vague answers were not going to suffice. He told her everything was healthy and normal and to eat well and rest when she could. "I rest adequately," she said. "You should rest more than adequately," he said. "You are building a person." She looked at him as though this were an interesting way to frame it. "That is a very useful way to think about it," she said. "All right, I will rest more." She did not rest appreciably more than she had before, but she did allow Clarence to carry more of the heavier work, and she allowed Bobby Ames to take over the morning herd count so that she could sleep until a more reasonable hour, which Bobby Ames did with an enthusiasm that suggested he would have done it regardless of the reason. The fall cattle work finished well that year. Better than the year before, considerably better than the year of the fever. The herd count at the end of October was 268, up from 240 when Edna arrived, a combination of natural increase and the financial adjustments that had allowed Clarence to reinvest in the herd rather than simply maintaining it. The east fence was complete. The kitchen roof had been repaired in September. The account books showed a position that was not comfortable but was solid, and the projection Edna had written out for the following year, based on current feed costs and anticipated cattle prices, and the market reports she had taken to reading carefully in the weekly Laredo newspaper, was cautiously optimistic. Clarence read the projection sitting at the desk one evening while Edna was reading by the fire, the lamplight warm and steady, the ranch quiet around them, and he looked up from the paper and said, "You think we could be in a genuine surplus position by the end of next year?" "If the cattle prices hold and we maintain the feed arrangement, yes," she said without looking up from her book. "The herd needs to reach 300 to provide the margin, but we are on track for that." "Edna," he said. She looked up. "When I wrote that letter to the Matrimonial Gazette," he said, "I was hoping for a wife who would be a genuine partner. I did not know what that would actually look like in practice. I had an idea but not a specific picture." She set the book down, giving him her full attention. "You are so far beyond what I was hoping for," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him, and the lamplight was making everything warm and golden, and outside it had turned genuinely cold for the first time that fall, with the October wind coming down from the north, and inside it was entirely safe and warm and real. "Come here," she said. He got up from the desk and came to sit beside her on the settee, and she leaned into him and he put his arm around her and she put her hand over his and they sat together in the firelight, and he pressed his lips to her hair and felt the warmth and solidity of her beside him and felt, with a fullness that went all the way through him, that his life had become something genuinely large. "I did not know I could feel like this," he said. "I want you to know that too." "I know," she said quietly. "I see it. I feel the same way." A pause. "It is somewhat inconvenient because it makes it very difficult to be purely practical about anything anymore." He smiled into her hair. "Is that my fault?" "Entirely," she said, and he could hear the warmth in it. Winter came early and hard that year, the coldest November in recent memory for West Texas, with northers that drove the temperature down sharply and kept the cattle in the south pasture, where the land offered some protection from the wind. Clarence and his hands worked long hours keeping the herd fed and healthy, and Edna kept the house running with the same calm efficiency as always, adding to it the particular warmth of someone who was investing deeply in the place, not just maintaining it but genuinely building it. She put up preserves that fall, jars and jars of them from the kitchen garden she had planted in late spring and tended through the summer, peaches from the trees that grew along the creek bottom, green beans and corn and tomatoes. The cellar under the house was organized and stocked in a way it had never been in Clarence's 11 years on the property, and he stood looking at it one November afternoon and thought about the years he had eaten salt pork and coffee and biscuits through the winter months, because he had neither the time nor the knowledge to do otherwise, and felt a kind of retrospective sadness for his previous self and a corresponding gratitude for his current situation that was so strong it was almost physical. Bobby Ames got himself into a situation in December that caused some difficulty. He had been spending his town days in the company of a girl named Leila Perkins, who was the daughter of the livery stable owner, and Leila's father came to the ranch one December afternoon in a state of controlled fury to speak to Clarence about the matter of Bobby's intentions. Clarence brought Bobby in from the barn, and the conversation that followed was uncomfortable and necessary, and it resulted in Bobby looking at his boots for 20 minutes and then agreeing that he would speak to Leela properly and formalize his intentions with a visit to Reverend Fowler, which he did the following Sunday. Edna had been in the kitchen during this conversation and had heard all of it through the thin wall, and when Perkins had gone and Bobby had gone back to the barn and Clarence came into the kitchen, she said, without looking up from her biscuit making, "You handled that well." "You heard that," he said. "The walls in this house are not designed for privacy," she said. "What would you have done differently?" he asked. She considered. "Nothing, actually," she said. "You were direct and fair and you did not belittle the boy." "That is the right approach." A pause. "He is going to marry that girl, by the way." Clarence looked at her. "Do you think so?" "He has been in love with her since September," she said. "I noticed it when he stopped making excuses to come to the kitchen." Clarence thought about this. "Because he found somewhere else to go." "Precisely." Bobby Ames and Leela Perkins were engaged by February and married the following spring, and Edna made Leela a wedding gift of a complete set of household accounts instructions written in her clear hand, organized by category and season, which Leela received with some bewilderment, and which, Bobby reported later, she had found more useful than anything else she owned. Christmas that year was the first Christmas Clarence had kept since his brother James died, which was not a coincidence. He had not felt any reason to make particular note of the day in the years since, and the habit had simply fallen away. Edna asked him in November whether they kept Christmas, and he told her the truth about it, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "We will keep it this year." She organized it with her usual precision, and with a warmth that surprised him, because he had come to know her warmth, but he had not anticipated its particular expression at Christmas, which involved a careful trimming of the house with pine boughs brought from the canyon country south of the ranch. A Christmas dinner that fed all five of them, Clarence and Edna and Tom Briggs and Dutch Vander and Bobby Ames, with a generosity that left everyone slightly unable to move afterward. She found, somehow in the weeks before, a book on astronomy she had been cataloging Clarence's interest in from his habit of naming stars on the porch in the evenings, and gave it to him wrapped in brown paper with a card that said simply, "For looking up," which was the most perfect gift he had ever received. He gave her a set of proper account ledgers, which he had ordered from San Antonio in October, leather-bound with her name stamped on the front cover in gilt letters. She took them out of the wrapping and held them in both hands and looked at them, and her face did the thing it did when she was genuinely moved, the thing she usually controlled so well, and she looked up at him and said, "Clarence, these are beautiful." "You needed better ones," he said. "I did," she said, "but you could have given me plain ones." "You are not a plain ledger kind of person," he said. She laughed, and then she reached for him, and he held her in the Christmas kitchen with the pine smell around them and the fire going in the sitting room, and outside the winter was hard and cold and wide, and inside it was everything good. Tom Briggs, watching from the doorway with his coffee cup, turned away with the expression of a man who has witnessed something private and is glad of it. February brought the baby news that the pregnancy was progressing normally, and that by Edna's accounting the birth would come in late May or early June. She had been reading everything she could find on the subject, which in Dusty Creek meant Dr. Horace's reference book, and 2 texts she had ordered from Chicago, and she had a thorough and precise understanding of what was coming that she shared with Clarence in the evenings, with the same matter-of-fact clarity she brought to cattle health records. "I want a midwife," she said one February evening. "Dr. Horace is adequate, but a midwife has specific experience that is more relevant." "There is a woman named Marta Garza in Redrock who is well regarded," Clarence said. "Tom Briggs's wife was delivered by her last year." "Tom Briggs has a wife," Edna said, stopping. "Had one," Clarence said. "She died, the baby too. It was 3 years ago before you came." A silence. "I did not know that," she said quietly. "He does not speak of it," Clarence said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I will speak to him." Not because she needed to, and not because it was practical, but because she was Edna, and she could not know a grief without acknowledging it. The conversation she had with Tom Briggs 2 days later, in the barn while she was ostensibly looking at the state of the horses' winter coats, lasted 20 minutes and was never repeated in its particulars to anyone. Whatever passed between them was private. What changed was that afterward Tom Briggs, who had been careful with Edna in the way you are careful around something you respect but do not quite know, became something different. Not warm exactly. Tom Briggs was not a warm man but present. Attentive in the way a person is attentive to something they have decided matters to them. He brought in firewood every morning without being asked, from February onward. He fixed the kitchen doorstep, which had been loose for weeks, without mentioning it. When the baby came, Clarence found out later, Tom Briggs had ridden to redrock himself in the pre-dawn dark to bring Marta Garza back, covering 22 miles in the cold night without complaint, because he had decided it was something that needed to be done. The winter passed into spring with the gradual, magnificent way of Texas, the cold withdrawing and the land softening, and the mesquite leafing out in its tentative early spring way that always seemed slightly surprised by its own return. The baby trees on the south side of the house were putting out new growth, small and determined, and Edna stood at them one April morning and looked at their new leaves with an expression that was entirely happy. "They are going to live," she said. "Of course they are," Clarence said. "I was not certain," she said. "Through the worst of the winter cold I was not certain." "You watered them every week even in the cold months," he said. "Dutch checked the roots 3 times. Dutch was concerned about the roots," she said. "Dutch is concerned about those trees in the way Dutch is concerned about most things," Clarence said. Silently and completely, she smiled. "He is a good man." "They all are," Clarence said. "You know that." She looked at him in the soft April morning. She was 7 months along, and the pregnancy was obvious now, and she had made no particular adjustment to her habits beyond removing herself from the heavier outdoor work, though she still walked the property every day and still ran the kitchen and the accounts with complete efficiency. She looked beautiful to him in a way that was not separate from who she was, as though everything that was Edna was becoming more fully expressed, more fully present. He walked to her and took her hand, and they stood together looking at the young trees. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "A year ago I was standing in this exact yard watching you get off that stagecoach," he said. "And you looked at this street and said you had seen prettier sights in a Chicago alley." She laughed softly. "I was nervous," she said. "I say sharp things when I am nervous." "I know," he said. "I know that now. But at the time I did not know you yet, and I looked at you and I thought, this is exactly the person I was hoping for, before I had spoken a single word to you, before I knew anything about you except that you had stepped off a stage in a strange town and said the first true thing that came to your mind." She was looking at him now. "You thought that, the moment you spoke," he said. "I had spent 2 years thinking the person I needed might not exist. And then you said exactly what you saw out loud without apology, and I knew." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I was looking at you too while I was saying it." "Were you?" "I was looking at you to see how you would respond," she said. "That is always the test, isn't it? What a person does when you say the unvarnished truth in front of them. Most people flinch. They make it smaller, or they change the subject, or they tell you it is not quite appropriate. You took your hat off and smiled." "I was glad," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see it. And that was when I thought, all right, this might actually work." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, over his heart, and she let him. And they stood in the spring morning with everything growing around them, and the cattle in the south pasture, and the windmill turning, and the young trees putting out their April leaves. "I love you," he said. "I love you with the kind of depth that has nothing to do with being practical and everything to do with who you actually are. I love you the same way," she said, and her voice was full and steady and true. "Every exact part of you." The baby came in the last week of May, on a Wednesday, which was, as Edna noted afterward with some irony, an entirely ordinary day weather-wise. Marta Garza was present, a calm, experienced woman in her 40s who Edna took to immediately and completely, which was the highest endorsement she was capable of giving. Clarence was in the yard for most of it, doing things with considerable purposelessness, picking up tools and putting them down, walking from the barn to the porch and back, while Tom Briggs sat on the fence rail and said nothing, because Tom Briggs understood that sometimes silence was the only thing that was useful. Bobby Ames, who was engaged now and feeling deeply the weight of impending domestic life, asked Tom Briggs at one point in a low voice how you were supposed to get through the waiting, and Tom Briggs said, "You just do," which was not entirely helpful but was entirely honest. The baby announced himself loudly and clearly at mid-morning, and Marta Garza opened the door to the yard and said to Clarence, "A son. Both well. Come in," and Clarence went in. Edna was propped up in bed with the most extraordinary expression on her face, which was exhaustion and triumph, and something so large and new it did not have a name. And in her arms was their son, red-faced and loud and very much present, and Clarence sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and his throat closed entirely for a long moment. "He has your ears," Edna said, examining the baby with a kind of critical assessment that was entirely recognizable as hers. Clarence managed a sound. "And your chin," she said. "I am not sure about the eyes yet, you cannot tell at this stage." "Edna," he managed. "Yes," she said. "He is perfect," Clarence said. She looked up from the baby at him, and her dark eyes were soft and full and entirely open. "He is, isn't he?" she said. They named him James, for Clarence's brother who had died in the 4th summer, and the name settled onto the child with an ease that felt like rightness, like something restored. Dutch Vander, when told the name, was quiet for a full minute and then said, "Good name," which was the longest speech anyone had heard from him in a month. Tom Briggs held the baby on the 3rd day, when Edna put the baby in his arms without asking, and the expression on Tom Briggs's face was not something anyone spoke about. But Clarence saw it from across the room and looked away quickly to give the man his privacy. Life with James Ramsey in it was different in all the ways Clarence had heard children change things, which was to say completely and beyond description. The ranch kept its rhythms, but they were woven around a new center, a center that was small and demanding and increasingly full of personality and entirely absorbing. Edna was a mother the way she was everything else, direct and devoted and without performance. She fed him and held him and talked to him from the very beginning in the same clear, direct language she used for everyone, which Marta Garza found amusing and Bobby Ames found charming and Tom Briggs found, in a private way, deeply right. Clarence watched her with James and felt things that defied his best efforts at articulation. He was a man who believed in the value of words, largely because Edna had shown him their value, but there were things that exceeded language, and watching his wife with his son was one of them. He just watched and was grateful. James grew the way healthy babies grow, quickly and with great determination. And by the fall of 1879, he was sitting up and examining the world with dark eyes that had turned out to be exactly like Edna's, alert and direct and taking in everything. Clarence would sit with him on the porch in the evenings and name the stars, as he did, and James would look up at the enormous sky with an expression of serious concentration that was so precisely his mother's expression that Clarence would sometimes have to look away and smile. The ranch that year was its best yet. 312 head of cattle by the October count. The east fence solid and maintaining. The feed arrangement still in place and still saving them money. The kitchen roof repairs had held through the summer rains without a leak. The account books in Edna's clear hand showed the surplus she had projected, modest but real, a foundation. Edna stood in the kitchen one October evening with the account books open in front of her and James on her hip, examining the numbers with the focused look that still made Clarence smile when he saw it from across the room, and she said, without looking up, "We can afford to expand the herd next spring. Another 40 head would put us in a genuinely strong position. Do you think the grass will support it?" he asked from the doorway. "With the additional pasture rotation I proposed in September, yes," she said. "I ran the numbers 3 times. "Of course you did," he said. She looked up. James made a sound and grabbed at the account book with one hand, and she gently redirected his attention with the other. "He is already interested in the books," she said. "He is interested in everything," Clarence said. "He is yours." She smiled at him over the baby's head, the full warm smile, and the lamp was making everything golden and outside. The fall was beginning to turn the air sharp and clean, and the windmill was spinning, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the young trees along the south wall of the house were now, at 1.5 years of growth, already visible enough to cast the first small shadows in the afternoon sun. In the spring of 1880, they planted more trees. 8 new ones along the east side, as Edna had proposed that first fall, and 4 along the north fence line to break the winter wind. James sat in the yard and watched the planting with focused attention and occasionally tried to eat the soil, which Edna addressed with the same direct clarity she addressed everything. "No," she said, "that is dirt. We do not eat dirt." James considered this information and tested it twice more before accepting it. Bobby Ames and Leela were expecting their first child by spring, and Leela came to Edna for advice with the kind of trust that had developed between them over the past year, and Edna gave it fully and honestly and without condescension, and Marta Garza was arranged for again, and Tom Briggs rode for her again in the early hours without being asked. Mrs. Hawthorne came to the ranch that spring to call, which she had not done before. She came on a Tuesday afternoon in April with a jar of preserved plums and a slightly stiff manner, and sat in the sitting room drinking coffee while Edna put James down for his afternoon sleep. And when Edna came back and sat down, Mrs. Hawthorne said, with the air of someone committing to a difficult truth, "I was not kind to you when you arrived. I was unkind in the things I said about you, in certain parlors. I want you to know that I know it." Edna looked at her. Then she said, "I appreciate you saying so. I was not unaware of it." Mrs. Hawthorne's mouth tightened slightly. "I imagine not." "For what it is worth," Edna said, "I do not think you were being malicious. I think I surprised you and you responded to surprise with caution. I understand that." Mrs. Hawthorne looked at her for a moment and then said, "You are a more generous person than I gave you credit for being." "I am a practical person," Edna said. "Holding grudges takes up space that I need for other things." Mrs. Hawthorne startled into a laugh which seemed to surprise her. And then something in her expression settled, the stiffness easing, and she said, "Your husband is a very lucky man." "He earned it," Edna said. "He was honest with me from the beginning. That is not a small thing." Mrs. Hawthorne took her preserved plums home uneaten, because Edna sent her back with 3 jars of her own preserves in exchange, and stopped in Dusty Creek's Main Street to tell Mrs. Prout that Edna Ramsey was not what she had thought, and Mrs. Prout, who had thought so for 2 years already, said kindly that she was glad Mrs. Hawthorne had discovered it. The summer of 1880 was hot even by Texas standards, the kind of heat that tested everything, the land and the cattle and the people alike. Clarence and his hands worked through it with the resignation of men who knew there was no alternative, and Edna ran the house through it with undiminished efficiency, and made sure the water was always cold, and the meals always ready, and that James, who was 14 months old and walking with unstable determination all over the property, did not wander into the sun unprotected or attempt to put anything else unsuitable into his mouth. In the evenings they sat on the porch in the last of the cooling air, the day's work done, James asleep inside, the night building its great dark canopy overhead, and they talked or were quiet, and it was entirely sufficient either way, because they had built the kind of companionship that does not require noise to fill it. One such evening Clarence said, "I want to tell you what this year has been." Edna, who was rocking slowly in the rocking chair she had acquired from the general store in the spring, looked at him. "3 years ago I was sitting here alone," he said, "and I was trying to be content with it, and I was not. I was telling myself that the ranch was enough, and I did not quite believe it. I was doing the work that needed doing and eating badly and going to bed in an empty house and getting up and doing it again, and there was nothing wrong with it exactly, and something was wrong with it precisely. She was listening with complete attention. "And now I sit here and the ranch is better than it has ever been," he said. "And I have a son who is going to know the names of the stars before he can properly walk. And I have 3 men who work for me and are genuinely well. And I have you sitting there in that rocking chair. And I am trying to explain to you what the difference is, and I cannot find the exact right words for it." She looked at him steadily. "Try," she said. "It is the difference between a thing being simply survived and a thing being genuinely lived," he said. "I was surviving the ranch, and now I am living it, because of you. Because you came here and looked at everything, including me, with completely open eyes and decided it was worth building and then built it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You built it with me." "I did," he said, "but you changed what I thought was possible." She left the rocking chair and came to sit beside him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the Texas night went on forever in every direction, full of stars and warm air and the distant sound of cattle and the slow turning of the windmill. "Clarence," she said. "Yes." "I want another one," she said. He looked down at her. "Another what?" "Baby," she said. "Eventually." "Not immediately, but eventually." He was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, and even in the dark she could see it because she knew his face as well as she knew anything. "All right," he said. "You are not surprised," she said. "Nothing you say surprises me anymore," he said. "You have cured me of being surprised." "Good," she said. "It is more efficient." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I want another one too," he said. "I want as many as you are willing." She considered. "2 more," she said. "Perhaps 3. Then we shall aim for 2 or 3 more," he said. "I will inform you when I have decided precisely," she said. He laughed into her hair and she laughed quietly, and the night went on around them, warm and enormous and entirely theirs. The second baby, a boy they named Thomas after Tom Briggs, which caused Tom Briggs to go very quiet for a full day, and then thereafter to behave with an additional solidity and attentiveness that was his way of saying what he could not say in words, came in the winter of 1881. He was loud and round and had, from the very beginning, the energetic and persistent temperament that would define him, different from James in every way but equally himself. And James, who was 2.5 years old when Thomas arrived, regarded his brother with the serious assessment of a child who has his mother's eyes and takes things as they are. By the time Thomas was pulling himself upright against the furniture, the ranch was 3 years past its worst and solidly in the best period of its history. The herd was 350 head. The finances were stable and growing. The house had been expanded with a second room added to the east side, which Clarence and Tom Briggs and Dutch Vander had built over the course of a summer using stone from the creek bottom and timber hauled from the canyon country, and which had good windows and a southern exposure, and a wooden floor that Edna was privately very pleased with, though she said only that it was adequate and would need recaulking in 2 years. Dutch Vander, in the fall of 1881, announced with characteristic concision that he was going to Laredo to marry a woman named Helga Mauer, who had arrived from Germany in the spring. No one had known anything about Helga Mauer. Dutch had been going to Laredo on his days off for 6 months, which everyone had assumed was simply Dutch doing whatever Dutch did on his days off, and it had apparently been this. He said it at supper one Thursday evening and then went back to eating as though he had mentioned the weather. There was a moment of complete silence, and then Edna said, "That is wonderful, Mr. Vander." "When?" "Sunday week," he said. "Will you bring her here?" Edna asked. "She will want to meet you," he said, with the tone of a man who has discussed this and made a decision. "She is nervous about the West." "Bring her to supper," Edna said. "Tell her not to be nervous. Tell her I arrived here knowing no one and found it entirely workable." Dutch nodded. Clarence looked at Edna, who was cutting her bread with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had just smoothly and generously resolved something with no fuss at all. And he thought for perhaps the 1,000th time since the spring of 1878 that he was the luckiest man in Dusty Creek and possibly in the state of Texas. Helga Vander turned out to be a broad, practical woman of 33 who had farmed in Bavaria and had very clear ideas about soil and weather and the proper making of bread. And she and Edna, within 30 minutes of meeting each other, were in the kitchen discussing the relative merits of different flour types with the focused intensity of two people who have found a subject they share. And Dutch Vander sat on the porch with Clarence and drank his coffee with the expression of a man who is profoundly relieved. The years unfolded. Dusty Creek grew, as all West Texas towns grew in those years, tentatively and with the particular character of places that are still deciding what they want to be. A new schoolhouse was built in 1882, a proper timber building with 2 rooms and a covered porch, and Edna was one of the 3 people most responsible for its existence, having organized the petition, managed the funds collection, written 3 letters to the county board, and generally applied her considerable organizational abilities to the project with the same precision she applied to the ranch accounts. The school board, initially composed entirely of men who found her involvement slightly confronting, found within 6 months that the project moved considerably faster with her on it, and simply adjusted their expectations accordingly. James Ramsey started at the school in 1883 when he was 4, which was slightly younger than usual, but his mother had been teaching him letters since he was 2.5 and reading with him every evening since he could sit upright without assistance, and the school teacher, a capable young woman named Miss Albright who had come from St. Louis and who took an immediate and delighted interest in an enthusiastic student, said that James was already reading at a level that was unusual for his age and should be encouraged in every way possible. Edna received this news with composure. Clarence received it with the transparent delight of a man who has given up pretending not to be proud. Thomas, who turned 2 that year, was by disposition less interested in sitting still with books and more interested in the outdoors, in animals, in the mechanics of everything the ranch did. And by the time he was 3, he was following Tom Briggs around with a purposefulness that Tom Briggs accepted with quiet pleasure. Tom Briggs taught Thomas the names of the cattle horses before Thomas could properly say them, and Thomas tried to say them anyway with a determination that was his father's in miniature. In 1884, the 3rd child arrived. A girl this time whom they named Clara, not after Clarence's first intended but after Edna's mother, whose name happened to be the same. She arrived in June in the heat, with the same direct and vocal announcement her brothers had made, and Marta Garza, who by now came to the Ramsey Ranch with the ease of long acquaintance, declared her healthy and strong and beautifully formed. James, who was 5, looked at his sister with his mother's eyes and said, "She is very small." "She will not always be," Edna said. "Will she talk?" he asked. "Eventually, yes," Edna said, "probably quite a lot." Clarence, sitting on the bed with Edna's hand in both of his, looked at their daughter and thought that the world was very large and very good, and that he would spend the rest of his life grateful for the spring day in 1878, when a woman had stepped off a stagecoach in the dust of Dusty Creek and said the first true thing that came to her mind. The ranch in 1885 was nothing like the ranch of 1878. It was not simply larger, though it was larger, the herd now consistently above 400 head, the land properly fenced, the finances genuinely strong. It was the difference between a place that was being maintained and a place that was being grown, tended, loved. The trees along the south wall were tall enough to shade the porch in the afternoon, exactly as Edna had predicted when she planted them. The kitchen garden that she had started in her first spring had expanded along the south fence of the yard into something impressive, cared for by Edna and increasingly by James and Thomas, who both understood from very young that the garden was not optional and that its produce was both practical and satisfying. Dutch Vander and Helga had built their own small house on the Ramsey property at Clarence's invitation, a solid stone building at the northeast corner of the land, and Helga's bread had become, over the years, a fixed and beloved feature of the Ramsey household, because Helga considered it a personal responsibility to keep everyone adequately fed, and Edna considered this entirely agreeable. Bobby Ames had left the ranch the previous year, not in any difficult circumstance, but because he and Leela had bought their own small property north of town, and Bobby was making his own beginning, and Clarence had helped him do it with money and advice given freely and without strings, because Bobby had been a good hand and a better young man, and deserved everything he was building. They came to supper at the ranch monthly, and Bobby's son, 2 years old, and James were already fast friends. Tom Briggs was still at the ranch, and Clarence did not think Tom Briggs would ever leave. The ranch had become, in some quiet way, Tom Briggs's home in the fullest sense, and Thomas Ramsey, who had Tom Briggs's name and his disposition, was Tom's shadow and his particular joy in a way that neither of them discussed because neither of them needed to. On an evening in the fall of 1885, with the harvest done and the herd in good order and the children asleep and the house quiet around them, Clarence and Edna sat on the porch where they had sat so many hundreds of times since that first spring, and the trees along the south wall were full and rustling in the evening breeze, and the windmill was turning, and the sky was doing its extraordinary thing with stars and darkness. Edna said, "I want to tell you what I see from here." He looked at her profile in the starlight, the face he knew entirely and loved completely. "I see the ranch I rode up to in a wagon in the evening light in 1878, she said. "And it is not the same ranch, and it is exactly the same ranch." "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that it is in the same place with the same land," she said. "The windmill is the same windmill. The barn is the same barn, though it has been repainted twice. But everything inside it and around it is different because we have been here and have been ourselves in it and have put ourselves into it completely. That is what a place is, isn't it? The accumulation of everyone who has poured themselves into it." He looked at the ranch, following her gaze, the house with its full trees, the new room on the east side where the children slept, the well that had been solid from the beginning, the east fence in its heavier gauge wire, the graves at the east corner where James Ramsey Sr. had been laid 20 years ago, and where Clarence visited on certain mornings and talked to his brother about the ranch and the children and the life that had been built on what they had started together. "You have poured yourself into it completely," he said. "We both have," she said. "Edna." He turned to face her fully, as he had so many times, and she turned to face him, and the stars were overhead and the night was warm and still and enormous. "Yes," she said. "Do you know what I thought the first morning you were here?" he said. "The first morning when I came into the kitchen and you had already been up for an hour and had reorganized the provisions and made coffee and were standing at the window looking out at the property. What did you think?" she asked. "I thought, this is a woman who is going to be completely at home here," he said. Not because the place suited her or because she was delighted by it, but because she was the kind of person who makes herself at home in things by working at them, by paying attention, by caring. She was quiet for a moment. "I do care," she said. "I care about this place enormously. I care about all of it." "I know," he said. "That is one of the many things I love about you. You do not pretend not to care. You just care directly and completely, and you say so." "I learned from you," she said. "You were the first person who said what he meant and meant what he said. I was watching for it because I expected it to stop. It never did. It never will," he said. She reached for his hand in the dark, and he took it, as he had taken it hundreds of times, and their hands knew each other entirely, the particular way of holding that was theirs, and the night went on around them with all its vast and generous dark and all its stars. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. "With everything, with every practical and impractical part of me, completely and without reservation." The stars were very bright that night, and the windmill turned slowly, and from inside the house came the small sound of a child shifting in sleep, and the ranch that had been built by two honest people who had found each other across 3 months of letters and a morning stagecoach arrival in the spring of 1878 lay quiet and full and whole around them, and everything in it was theirs, built by their hands and their honesty and their love. And it was a good life, genuinely and abundantly good. The kind that does not arrive complete but is made, day by day and truth by truth, and season by season, by people who are willing to say what they see and mean what they say and show up every morning for. The work of building something real together. James Ramsey would grow up and go to university in Austin, and would come back to the ranch and bring ideas and methods that made it better still, and would carry both of his parents in him, his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and the combined love of them that had made him who he was. Thomas Ramsey would grow up to be the best cattle man in that part of Texas, which was something Tom Briggs would say in his final years, with an expression that was as close to pride as the language of his face allowed, and which was no less true for being quietly said. Clara Ramsey would grow up with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet warmth, and a way with numbers that she had from her mother entirely, and which she would use to run the ranch accounts with the same leather-bound ledgers, reordered over the years, that Clarence had given Edna that first Christmas with her name in gilt. And Edna Graves Ramsey would stand on that porch on many more evenings than she could count and look at the trees she had planted, and the ranch she had helped build, and the man who stood beside her with his hand in hers, and she would feel what she had felt on that first Tuesday evening after supper with the lantern light and the wide sky, which was that she was glad she had come, which was the most certain truth she knew. She had arrived speaking her mind immediately, on a May morning in 1878, stepping off a stagecoach in the dust of Dusty Creek, and saying exactly what she saw without apology, because that was who she was and who she had always been and who she would always be. And Clarence Ramsey had taken off his hat and smiled at her from across a crowd of startled townsfolk, and told her later that evening, standing in his kitchen with the honest confession of a man who had been waiting without knowing quite what he was waiting for, that he had been waiting for exactly that. Not for a woman who would soften herself for him, not for a woman who would be gentled by his expectations or shaped by the requirements of the town or the frontier or the century. For a woman who would stand in the dust of a new place and say what she saw and mean it and keep meaning it day after day and year after year, in the beautiful and demanding and entirely real life they were going to build together. And they had built it, and it was good, and it was entirely, irrevocably, abundantly theirs.